In October of 1893, construction workers breaking ground for a new railway line outside the village of Millbrook made a discovery that would haunt the English countryside for generations. Buried beneath what had once been the herb garden of the respected Thornfield medical practice lay the remains of 179 souls, their bones bearing the unmistakable marks of surgical instruments and experimental procedures. What the workers had unearthed was not merely a mass grave, but evidence of the most systematic and calculated series of medical murders in recorded British history. Before we descend into this tale of betrayal and butchery, understand that this story is not for the faint of heart. Only those brave enough to confront the darkest chapters of medical history should continue. If you're ready to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to let these crimes be forgotten, subscribe now and let us know in the comments what country you're listening from tonight. The world needs to remember what happened in Millbrook, and together we ensure these victims are never forgotten. The Thornfield name had once commanded respect throughout the Yorkshire Dales. Dr. Edmund Thornfield arrived in Millbrook during the bitter winter of 1887, his credentials impeccable and his manner refined. Edinburgh Medical College had produced few finer graduates, and his letters of recommendation spoke of a brilliant mind dedicated to advancing the boundaries of medical science. The village desperately needed a physician. The previous doctor had succumbed to consumption the year before, leaving the community of 800 souls without proper medical care. Edmund Thornfield was 42 years old when he established his practice in the renovated manor house on the outskirts of Millbrook. Tall and distinguished, with prematurely silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, he possessed the kind of authoritative presence that inspired immediate confidence. His wife Margaret, a former nurse who had trained at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, seemed the perfect complement to his professional demeanour. Together, they represented everything the isolated farming community could hope for in medical practitioners. The Thornfield family appeared to be a blessing sent by Providence itself. Margaret's experience treating cholera victims during the London outbreak of 1884 had given her invaluable knowledge of disease management and patient care. Their son Victor, 20 years old and already accepted to medical school, demonstrated the same keen intellect as his father. Even their youngest, 12-year-old Catherine, showed an unusual interest in her father's work, often seen carrying his medical bag or organizing his instruments with meticulous care. The practice flourished from its very first months. Dr. Thornfield's treatment seemed remarkably effective, his surgical skills superior to anything the region had previously known. Patients who had suffered from chronic ailments for years found relief under his care. Women who had struggled through difficult pregnancies delivered healthy children with his assistance. The elderly, who had resigned themselves to painful declining years, discovered renewed vitality through his innovative therapies. Word of the miracle doctor spread throughout the surrounding counties. Patients began travelling from as far as Leeds and Manchester to seek treatment at the Thornfield medical practice. The doctor charged modest fees, often accepting payment in livestock or crops from struggling farmers. His charity toward the poor became legendary, and his willingness to treat anyone regardless of their ability to pay earned him a reputation as a saint among healers. But beneath this facade of medical excellence and Christian charity, something far more sinister was taking root. The very qualities that made Dr. Thornfield so effective as a physician, his analytical mind and steady hands, were being employed for purposes that would have horrified his grateful patients. The surgical skills he had mastered to save lives were being refined and perfected to end them in ways that served his growing obsession with medical experimentation. The transformation did not happen overnight. Like all the most dangerous predators, Edmund Thornfield was patient, methodical, and supremely calculating. He understood that success in his darker pursuits would require the same careful planning and attention to detail that had made him such a respected physician. The trust he had built within the community would serve as both shield and weapon in the campaign of terror he was secretly planning. Margaret proved to be far more than a passive observer of her husband's descent into depravity. Her nursing background had given her intimate knowledge of patient records, medical procedures, and the administrative aspects of healthcare that would prove invaluable in concealing their crimes. Her ability to forge death certificates, manipulate patient files, and maintain the appearance of normal medical practice made her an indispensable partner in the horrors that were to come. Young Victor's medical training became a family affair in ways that would have appalled his instructors at university. Summer breaks from his studies were spent not in rest and recreation, but in intensive education in the family's true profession. His father's lessons in anatomy took on a practical dimension that no legitimate medical school would have sanctioned. His steady hands and quick mind made him an eager student of techniques that had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with prolonging suffering for experimental purposes. Even little Catherine was gradually drawn into the family enterprise. Her natural curiosity about her father's work was carefully channeled and encouraged. Tasks that seemed innocent enough, organizing medical supplies, cleaning instruments, maintaining patient records, slowly evolved into more direct participation in activities that would have been unthinkable in any normal household. The child's capacity for accepting and normalizing the abnormal would prove to be one of the most chilling aspects of the entire Thornfield legacy. The first victims were chosen with the same careful consideration that marked all of Edmund Thornfield's professional decisions. Transient workers passing through the region during harvest season, traveling merchants with no fixed address, elderly patients with no surviving family members. People whose disappearance would cause minimal investigation, whose absence might be attributed to natural causes or voluntary departure. The doctor's reputation for miraculous cures provided perfect cover for patients who seemed to recover completely before mysteriously vanishing from the area. The methodology was refined through months of careful practice and observation. Patients would be diagnosed with conditions requiring extended treatment and isolation. Family members would be assured that the healing process demanded complete rest and minimal visitation. Death certificates would be prepared and filed with local authorities, stating natural causes that were entirely consistent with the patient's known medical history. Bodies would be disposed of through a network of contacts that Edmund had cultivated among less scrupulous members of the medical and funeral industries. By the spring of 1889, the Thornfield operation had achieved a level of efficiency and security that allowed for significant expansion. What had begun as opportunistic targeting of the most vulnerable members of society evolved into a systematic program of patient selection and elimination. The very success of the practice, the growing reputation for medical miracles, created an endless supply of potential victims who came seeking healing and found instead a fate far worse than the ailments that had driven them to seek treatment. The discovery of Father Brennan's body in the Thornfield medical practice on the morning of November 3, 1893, marked the beginning of an investigation that would ultimately expose the full scope of the family's criminal enterprise. The priest's death, initially attributed to heart failure during a pastoral visit, immediately attracted scrutiny from church authorities who were aware of his investigation into missing parishioners. Archbishop Thomas Whitfield personally dispatched investigators from York to examine the circumstances surrounding Father Brennan's death and to review the evidence he had been gathering. The church investigation team, led by Canon Robert Morrison, brought resources and authority that the family had never previously encountered. Unlike local officials who could be influenced through corruption or intimidation, these investigators answered directly to religious authorities in York and London who possessed both the motivation and capability to conduct thorough examinations of suspicious circumstances. Their arrival in Millbrook signaled the beginning of scrutiny that would prove impossible for the family to deflect or control. What makes this turning point even more remarkable is how close the Thornfield family came to eliminating all evidence of their crimes. Their systematic approach to documentation destruction and witness elimination had nearly succeeded in creating an impenetrable facade of legitimacy. If you're as amazed as we are by the meticulous planning behind these horrific crimes, hit that subscribe button and share this investigation with others who appreciate the importance of preserving these dark chapters of history. Your support helps ensure that these forgotten victims receive the recognition they deserve. Canon Morrison's investigation methodology proved devastatingly effective in penetrating the family's deception. The church investigators possessed detailed knowledge of Father Brennan's concerns and had access to copies of evidence that he had forwarded to York before his death. Their systematic examination of parish records, combined with interviews of community members who had confided in the priest, gradually revealed the true scope of disappearances that had occurred over the previous 6 years. Edmund's response to the church investigation demonstrated the desperation that had begun affecting his normally calculating approach to crisis management. His attempts to explain Father Brennan's death and discredit the priest's investigation became increasingly elaborate and inconsistent, creating new suspicions among investigators who possessed the expertise to recognize deceptive behavior. The charm and authority that had previously protected the family proved inadequate against trained investigators who were specifically seeking evidence of wrongdoing. Margaret's efforts to manage the documentary evidence during this critical period revealed the strain that years of criminal activity had placed on her mental stability. Her normally meticulous record-keeping became erratic and contradictory as she struggled to maintain consistency across multiple layers of false documentation while destroying evidence that might expose their crimes. Her mistakes during this period would provide crucial evidence for investigators who possessed the patience and expertise necessary to identify discrepancies. Victor's presence during the church investigation created additional complications for the family's security. His medical school training made him valuable for maintaining their facade of legitimate practice, but his involvement in the family's criminal activities had left him psychologically unstable and prone to errors that threatened to expose their secrets. His attempts to assist with crisis management revealed knowledge and capabilities that aroused suspicion among investigators who were specifically trained to identify inconsistencies in witness statements. The breakthrough in the church investigation came when Canon Morrison discovered discrepancies in burial records that revealed systematic fraud in death documentation extending back to the beginning of the family's operations. Father Brennan's meticulous record-keeping had provided a baseline for comparison that exposed the true scope of irregularities in official documentation. The church investigators possessed both the authority and expertise necessary to demand explanations for these discrepancies from civil authorities who had previously ignored or dismissed concerns about missing persons. Catherine's behavior during the investigation period demonstrated the psychological damage that years of participation in mass murder had inflicted on her development. Her attempts to maintain normal social interactions with community members and investigators revealed disturbing inconsistencies and emotional detachment that attracted attention from trained observers. Her participation in the family's criminal activities had left her incapable of maintaining the facade of innocence that had previously protected the operation. The family's attempt to escape official scrutiny through emergency destruction of evidence created new complications that would prove fatal to their security. Edmund's decision to burn patient records, experimental documentation, and correspondence generated suspicious activity that was observed by community members and reported to investigators. The smoke from their emergency document destruction attracted attention precisely when they needed to maintain the appearance of normal operations. Margaret's psychological breakdown during the investigation period resulted in critical errors that provided investigators with direct evidence of the family's criminal activities. Her attempts to maintain multiple false identities and cover stories simultaneously led to contradictions that could not be explained through innocent confusion or administrative error. Her deteriorating mental state made her increasingly unreliable as a participant in the family's deception campaign. The discovery of physical evidence in the basement facility represented the most damaging development in the church investigation. Canon Morrison's systematic search of the Thornfield property revealed surgical instruments, restraint devices, and chemical compounds that could not be explained through legitimate medical practice. The presence of this equipment, combined with testimony from community members about suspicious activities, provided concrete evidence that supported Father Brennan's accusations about systematic criminal behavior. Victor's attempt to flee Millbrook during the investigation created additional evidence of guilt that investigators could use to support their case against the family. His sudden departure from university and apparent panic about the church investigation attracted official attention and triggered communications with law enforcement authorities who possessed resources for tracking fugitives. His flight provided investigators with clear evidence that the family recognized their guilt and feared official prosecution. The family's network of corrupt contacts proved inadequate for managing the intensity and scope of the church investigation. Local officials who had previously provided protection and assistance distanced themselves from the Thornfield operation as the evidence of systematic criminal activity became overwhelming. The corruption that had protected the family for years became a liability as officials sought to avoid association with crimes that were attracting attention from higher authorities. Edmund's final attempt to maintain their deception involved elaborate claims about experimental medical research that had been authorized by unknown government agencies. His story about secret official sanction for his activities represented a desperate effort to explain the evidence that investigators had discovered while maintaining his claims of legitimacy. However, his inability to provide documentation or official contacts to support these claims only served to confirm suspicions about his criminal activities. The collapse of the family's security measures created a cascade effect that exposed evidence they had successfully concealed for years. As investigators gained access to previously hidden areas of their facility and documentation, the full scope of their systematic murder campaign became apparent, revealing crimes that exceeded even the most pessimistic estimates of their criminal activity. The formal arrest of Edmund Thornfield on December 15, 1893, marked the culmination of the most extensive criminal investigation in Yorkshire history. Inspector William Hartley of the York Police, working in coordination with church authorities and government officials, had assembled evidence documenting 179 murders committed over a period of 6 years. The scope and systematic nature of the crimes shocked even experienced investigators who had dealt with the most heinous criminal cases of the Victorian era. The network of accomplices and contacts that had enabled the Thornfield operation began unraveling as law enforcement authorities traced connections extending throughout northern England and into Scotland. Body procurement officers at medical schools, corrupt morgue attendants, and various middlemen who had profited from the family's disposal network were arrested and interrogated. Their testimony revealed the industrial scale of the operation and provided investigators with detailed information about the methods used to transport and eliminate evidence of the murders. Margaret Thornfield's capture occurred 3 days after her husband's arrest, when she was discovered attempting to board a ship bound for Ireland using forged travel documents. Her deteriorating mental condition had made successful escape impossible, as she carried incriminating evidence including detailed records of victim identities, experimental procedures, and financial transactions related to body sales. Her meticulous documentation, originally created to maintain operational security, provided investigators with a comprehensive record of the family's criminal activities. Victor's attempt to flee to Edinburgh proved futile when university authorities, alerted by investigators, discovered his true identity and role in the family's crimes. His medical school professors, horrified to learn that his exceptional surgical skills had been developed through practice on living victims, provided testimony about his unusual knowledge and disturbing behavior patterns. His academic papers, praised for their innovative insights into human anatomy and physiology, were revealed to be based on systematic torture and experimentation conducted on unwilling subjects. The arrest of Catherine Thornfield presented unique challenges for law enforcement authorities who were unprepared to deal with a juvenile who had been systematically trained in mass murder from childhood. At 17, she had participated in crimes that exceeded the experience of most adult criminals, yet her youth and apparent vulnerability complicated legal proceedings. Her detailed knowledge of the family's operations made her testimony crucial for understanding the full scope of their activities, but her psychological condition raised questions about her capacity to stand trial. The discovery of the mass grave behind the Thornfield medical practice provided physical evidence that corroborated testimony from surviving accomplices and documentation recovered from the family's records. Forensic examination of the remains revealed evidence of systematic torture, experimental procedures, and surgical manipulation that supported charges of murder, torture, and desecration of human remains. The condition of the bodies provided graphic evidence of the prolonged suffering inflicted on victims before their deaths. The trial proceedings, which began in March of 1894, attracted international attention as details of the systematic murder campaign were revealed through witness testimony and documentary evidence. Medical experts testified about the sophisticated nature of the experimental procedures, while church authorities described the impact of the crimes on local communities. The prosecution's case demonstrated not only the guilt of the accused but also the broader implications of their activities for public trust in medical institutions. Edmund Thornfield's defense strategy involved claims of mental illness and scientific justification for activities that he characterized as legitimate medical research conducted under government authorization. His attorneys argued that his medical training and dedication to advancing scientific knowledge had led him to pursue experimental procedures that were misunderstood by authorities lacking appropriate expertise. However, the systematic nature of the crimes and the obvious financial motivations made these arguments unconvincing to jurors who had heard detailed testimony about the torture and murder of innocent victims. Margaret's defense centered on claims of coercion and domestic abuse that had allegedly forced her participation in activities she personally opposed. Her attorneys presented evidence of her nursing background and charitable work as proof of her fundamentally caring nature, arguing that she had been manipulated and threatened by her husband into participating in crimes that violated her basic moral principles. The extensive documentation she had created, however, demonstrated active participation and planning that contradicted claims of reluctant cooperation. Victor's trial revealed the systematic grooming and indoctrination that had transformed a promising medical student into an accomplished torturer and killer. Expert testimony about psychological manipulation and family dynamics provided context for understanding how a young person could be corrupted into participating in such extreme criminal behavior. However, the evidence of his enthusiasm for experimental procedures and his role in planning victim elimination made arguments about coercion and manipulation less persuasive to jurors. The legal proceedings also exposed the broader network of corruption that had enabled the family's crimes to continue undetected for years. Local officials who had accepted bribes to ignore missing person reports, magistrates who had failed to investigate suspicious death certificates, and medical school administrators who had purchased bodies without investigating their sources all faced criminal charges. The systematic corruption revealed during the investigation led to reforms in oversight procedures and administrative accountability. The testimony of surviving family members who had reported missing relatives to Father Brennan provided the most emotionally powerful evidence presented during the trials. Their descriptions of loved ones who had sought medical treatment and never returned home demonstrated the human cost of the family's systematic criminal enterprise. The impact of their testimony on jurors and observers reinforced public demands for justice and severe punishment for the convicted murderers. The verdicts, delivered in July of 1894, reflected both the severity of the crimes and the legal limitations of the Victorian justice system. Edmund Thornfield was sentenced to death by hanging, while Margaret received life imprisonment with hard labor. Victor, as a juvenile participant who had been systematically groomed for criminal activity, received a sentence of 25 years imprisonment. Catherine's case was handled separately through juvenile proceedings that resulted in commitment to a reformatory institution for an indefinite period. The execution of Edmund Thornfield on August 23, 1894, drew crowds of observers who viewed his death as inadequate punishment for crimes that had shocked the civilized world. His final statement, delivered from the gallows, contained no expression of remorse for his victims but instead included complaints about the failure of authorities to recognize the scientific value of his experimental work. His death marked the end of the most systematic family murder enterprise in recorded British criminal history. The broader implications of the Thornfield case extended far beyond the punishment of individual criminals, triggering reforms in medical education, oversight of rural medical practices, and procedures for investigating missing person reports. The systematic nature of their crimes had exposed vulnerabilities in social institutions that had enabled mass murder to continue undetected, leading to changes designed to prevent similar criminal enterprises from developing in the future. The aftermath of the Thornfield trials reverberated throughout British society and beyond, fundamentally altering public perceptions of medical authority and rural healthcare systems. The revelation that a respected physician and his family had systematically murdered 179 patients while maintaining an exemplary public reputation challenged basic assumptions about trust, respectability, and the safeguards that supposedly protected vulnerable populations from predatory exploitation. Margaret Thornfield died in Holloway Prison in 1902, 8 years into her life sentence, reportedly from complications related to mental illness that had worsened dramatically during her incarceration. Prison records described her final years as marked by periods of lucidity during which she provided additional details about victims and methods, alternating with episodes of complete psychological breakdown. Her death ended the possibility of learning more about the operational details of crimes that had been systematically concealed through years of meticulous planning. Victor Thornfield served 18 years of his 25-year sentence before being released in 1912, having convinced prison authorities and reform advocates that he had been rehabilitated through education and religious instruction. His release proved controversial, as many believed that his crimes warranted lifetime imprisonment regardless of his age at the time of their commission. He emigrated to Canada under an assumed identity, where he reportedly lived quietly until his death in 1947, never again practicing medicine or revealing his true identity to associates. Catherine Thornfield's fate remained shrouded in official secrecy, as juvenile proceedings of the era were conducted with confidentiality protections that prevented public disclosure of details about her treatment and eventual disposition. Unofficial reports suggested that she remained institutionalized until 1910, when she would have reached her majority, but no records exist of her subsequent activities or fate. Some historians believe she may have been quietly released under a new identity, while others suggest she may have died during institutionalization. The Thornfield medical practice and family residence were demolished in 1895, following extensive excavation that revealed additional human remains and evidence of criminal activities extending back to the beginning of their residency in Millbrook. The site was eventually converted into a memorial garden dedicated to the victims of medical crimes, though local residents avoided the area for decades due to persistent rumors about supernatural phenomena and disturbing discoveries made during construction projects. The impact of the Thornfield case on medical education and professional oversight led to significant reforms in training procedures, ethical instruction, and regulatory supervision that remained influential well into the 20th century. Medical schools implemented new requirements for character assessment and psychological evaluation of students, while professional associations developed stricter oversight procedures for rural practitioners who operated with minimal peer supervision. The village of Millbrook never fully recovered from the association with the Thornfield crimes, experiencing population decline and economic stagnation that persisted for generations. Many families relocated to escape the stigma of having lived in a community where systematic murder had continued undetected for years. The local church, where Father Brennan had served before his murder, became a pilgrimage site for those seeking to honor the memory of the priest whose courage had exposed the crimes. The network of accomplices and contacts who had enabled the Thornfield operation faced varying degrees of punishment, with some receiving lengthy prison sentences while others escaped prosecution through cooperation with authorities or lack of sufficient evidence. The medical schools and research institutions that had purchased bodies without investigating their sources implemented new procurement procedures designed to prevent future involvement in similar criminal enterprises. The broader implications of the Thornfield case influenced criminal investigation procedures, missing person protocols, and interjurisdictional cooperation methods that became standard practices in law enforcement. The systematic nature of their crimes had demonstrated the need for better coordination between local authorities, religious institutions, and government agencies when investigating patterns of suspicious disappearances or unusual mortality rates. The psychological studies conducted on surviving family members contributed to early understanding of criminal psychology, family dynamics in criminal enterprises, and the processes through which individuals become capable of systematic violence against innocent victims. The case became a foundational reference for criminologists studying organized criminal behavior and the social conditions that enable predatory activity to continue undetected. What haunts us most about the Thornfield family is not just the brutality of their crimes, but their ability to maintain a facade of respectability while conducting systematic murder. Their story reminds us that evil often wears the mask of authority and charity, making vigilance and skepticism essential tools for protecting the vulnerable. As we conclude this investigation into one of history's most chilling medical murder cases, we must ask ourselves what lessons we can learn from these forgotten victims and their families. The legacy of Father Michael Brennan, whose moral courage and investigative persistence ultimately exposed the crimes, serves as a reminder that individual action can triumph over systematic evil when guided by conscience and determination. His willingness to pursue truth despite personal danger demonstrates the power of moral authority to challenge institutional corruption and protect innocent lives. The Thornfield case remains relevant to contemporary discussions about medical ethics, institutional oversight, and the protection of vulnerable populations from predatory exploitation. The systematic nature of their crimes, their ability to maintain professional respectability while conducting mass murder, and the institutional failures that enabled their activities provide sobering lessons about the eternal need for vigilance in protecting human dignity and rights. The 179 victims of the Thornfield family enterprise deserve to be remembered not merely as statistics in a criminal case, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by systematic evil disguised as medical charity. Their stories remind us that behind every crime statistic lies human suffering that demands both justice and remembrance. Share your thoughts about this chilling investigation in the comments below. What aspects of the Thornfield case do you find most disturbing, and what lessons should we learn from these forgotten crimes? Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to join our community of truth seekers dedicated to preserving the memory of history's forgotten victims and ensuring that such systematic evil never again escapes detection and punishment. The roots of Edmund Thornfield's descent into systematic murder stretched back to his earliest days at Edinburgh Medical College, where his fascination with human anatomy exceeded even that of his most dedicated classmates. While other students struggled with the moral implications of dissecting cadavers, Edmund displayed an unsettling enthusiasm for the work. His professors noted his exceptional skill with surgical instruments and his remarkable ability to remain emotionally detached during the most disturbing procedures. Margaret's background proved equally significant in shaping the family's future crimes. Her experience as a nurse during London's cholera epidemic of 1884 had exposed her to death on an industrial scale. She had watched hundreds of patients succumb to the disease, had seen how easily life could be extinguished, how little separated the living from the dead. More importantly, she had learned how medical records could be manipulated, how deaths could be attributed to natural causes, how the chaos of epidemic conditions could provide cover for activities that would normally attract unwanted attention. The couple's courtship had taken place against the backdrop of London's most notorious medical scandal. The Burke and Hare murders, though decades past, remained fresh in the minds of medical professionals. The case had demonstrated both the demand for fresh cadavers among anatomical researchers and the profits that could be made by those willing to supply them. Edmund and Margaret discussed these historical precedents with the clinical detachment of scholars, never imagining that they were laying the intellectual groundwork for their own future enterprises. Their marriage in 1885 represented more than a romantic union. It was a partnership between two individuals whose professional experiences had prepared them perfectly for collaborative criminality. Edmund's medical expertise and Margaret's administrative skills created a combination that would prove devastatingly effective in concealing mass murder behind the facade of legitimate medical practice. Their honeymoon was spent touring European medical facilities, ostensibly to study advanced surgical techniques, but actually to observe how different institutions handled patient records, death certificates, and body disposal. The decision to establish their practice in Millbrook was calculated with the same precision that would later characterize their selection of victims. The isolated Yorkshire village was far enough from major population centres to avoid unwanted scrutiny, yet close enough to transportation networks to attract patients from a wide geographic area. The local magistrate was known to be corrupt and easily influenced, the parish records were poorly maintained, and the nearest hospital was more than 50 miles away. These factors combined to create an ideal environment for medical crimes that might continue undetected for years. Victor's upbringing was carefully orchestrated to prepare him for his eventual role in the family business. From his earliest childhood, he was exposed to medical procedures and anatomical studies that would have been considered inappropriate for someone his age. His parents justified this unusual education as preparation for his future medical career, but the true purpose was far more sinister. By the time he reached adolescence, Victor had developed the same emotional detachment toward human suffering that characterized both his parents. Young Catherine's indoctrination began even earlier. Her parents recognized that a female family member could provide access to victims who might be suspicious of male medical practitioners. Midwifery and women's health issues offered opportunities for private consultations and extended treatments that could easily be manipulated for criminal purposes. Catherine's natural intelligence and eagerness to please made her an ideal candidate for grooming into the family's murderous activities. The Thornfield family's integration into Millbrook society proceeded with methodical precision. Edmund joined the local medical society, donated generously to church charities, and established himself as a pillar of community respectability. Margaret organized women's health seminars, taught basic nursing skills to village wives, and created a network of female contacts that would later prove invaluable for identifying potential victims. Their children were enrolled in local schools, participated in community activities, and displayed the kind of wholesome behavior that reinforced the family's reputation for moral virtue. This careful cultivation of community trust was not merely about maintaining appearances. It was a deliberate strategy for gaining access to the most vulnerable members of society. Elderly patients without family support, pregnant women facing difficult deliveries, children suffering from chronic illnesses, all became potential targets for the family's experimental procedures. The doctor's reputation for charitable work ensured that the poorest and most desperate members of the community would seek his help, making them ideal victims for crimes that might otherwise attract investigation. The family's private discussions during this period, recorded in Margaret's detailed diary that would later be discovered by investigators, revealed the systematic nature of their planning. They discussed optimal victim selection criteria, methods for disposing of bodies, techniques for forging medical records, and strategies for deflecting suspicion. These conversations were conducted with the same clinical detachment they might have applied to discussing legitimate medical procedures, demonstrating how completely they had divorced themselves from normal human empathy. The first deliberate murder took place on a rain-soaked November evening in 1888, exactly 1 year after the Thornfield family had established their practice in Millbrook. The victim was Thomas Hartwell, a 63-year-old itinerant farm laborer who had sought treatment for persistent chest pains that prevented him from working. Hartwell possessed all the characteristics that made him an ideal target. He was alone in the world, had no permanent address, carried what little money he owned in cash, and had told no one of his intention to visit the doctor. Edmund's examination revealed that Hartwell suffered from nothing more serious than muscle strain caused by years of heavy labor. The condition could have been treated with rest and simple medication, but the doctor saw an opportunity to test theories he had been developing about the effects of various experimental procedures on the human cardiovascular system. Hartwell was told that his condition was serious but treatable, requiring several days of intensive therapy under medical supervision. Margaret prepared a private room in the basement of their home, a space that had been converted into what appeared to be a legitimate medical treatment facility. The room contained all the equipment necessary for surgical procedures, along with restraints and soundproofing that would prove essential for the horrors that were about to unfold. Hartwell was given a mild sedative and told that the treatment would begin the following morning. The procedures that followed over the next 3 days represented Edmund's first systematic attempt to study the effects of deliberate cardiac manipulation on a living human subject. Using techniques he had learned during his medical training, he induced various forms of cardiac stress while monitoring Hartwell's responses. The victim was kept conscious throughout most of the procedures, his reactions carefully documented in notes that Margaret transcribed with clinical precision. Victor, home from university for the holiday break, was present for portions of these experimental sessions. His father explained each procedure in detail, treating the torture as an educational opportunity. The young man's ability to observe extreme human suffering without emotional response convinced Edmund that his son possessed the temperament necessary for full participation in future activities. Catherine, though not yet directly involved, was aware that something significant was happening in the basement, and her curiosity about her father's work intensified. Hartwell's death came on the 4th day, the result of cardiac failure induced by Edmund's experimental manipulations. The body was disposed of through contacts the doctor had cultivated among the network of individuals who supplied cadavers to medical schools. Official records showed that Thomas Hartwell had received treatment for chest pains, had seemed to recover, and had departed Millbrook to seek work elsewhere. No investigation was conducted, no questions were asked, and no one mourned the passing of a man who had lived his entire life on society's margins. The success of this first deliberate murder convinced the Thornfield family that their methods were sound and their security measures adequate. Edmund began developing more sophisticated experimental protocols, while Margaret refined their system for record keeping and victim disposal. They established relationships with body snatchers, corrupt morgue attendants, and medical school procurement officers who asked no questions about the source of their specimens. The second victim was selected 3 months later. Mary Whitmore, a 45-year-old widow who cleaned houses for wealthy families in nearby villages, had developed a persistent cough that she feared might be consumption. She had saved for months to afford medical consultation, and her desperation made her an ideal candidate for the family's expanding program of human experimentation. Mary's isolation, her lack of close family connections, and her fear of her symptoms made her particularly vulnerable to Edmund's manipulations. This time, the experimental focus shifted to respiratory system research. Edmund had become fascinated by the possibilities of studying lung function under controlled conditions of deliberate impairment. Mary was told that her condition required innovative treatment that might take several weeks to complete. She was given a room in the medical facility and told that the isolation was necessary to prevent spreading her condition to others in the community. The procedures inflicted upon Mary Whitmore represented a significant escalation in the sophistication and cruelty of the family's activities. Edmund used a combination of chemical agents and physical manipulations to systematically damage her respiratory system while monitoring the effects. Margaret maintained detailed records of each stage of the process, documenting symptoms, responses, and the victim's gradually declining condition with the same methodical approach she had once applied to legitimate nursing care. Victor's participation increased significantly during Mary's imprisonment and torture. He assisted with procedures, helped maintain the victim's restraints, and even suggested modifications to his father's experimental protocols. His medical training was being supplemented with practical experience that no legitimate institution would have provided. The young man's transformation from aspiring healer to accomplished torturer proceeded with frightening rapidity. The disposal of Mary Whitmore's body involved more elaborate procedures than had been necessary with Thomas Hartwell. Her disappearance required more careful documentation, as she had been known to several families in the area and her absence might eventually be noticed. Margaret forged a letter indicating that Mary had decided to move to London to seek better employment opportunities. The letter was delivered to Mary's landlord along with payment for her final month's rent, creating the impression that her departure had been planned and voluntary. By the spring of 1889, the Thornfield family had established operational procedures that would allow them to significantly expand their activities. They had proven that carefully selected victims could be tortured and murdered without attracting investigation. They had developed methods for disposing of bodies and creating false documentation to explain disappearances. Most importantly, they had confirmed that their family members possessed the psychological makeup necessary for long-term collaboration in systematic murder and torture. The systematic refinement of the Thornfield killing operation entered its most sophisticated phase during the summer of 1889. Edmund had spent months analyzing the successes and shortcomings of their initial murders, developing what he termed his selection protocols. These criteria would guide victim identification for the remainder of their criminal enterprise, ensuring maximum experimental value while minimizing investigative risk. The first element of Edmund's victim selection system focused on social isolation. Ideal candidates possessed minimal family connections, irregular employment histories, and transient living arrangements. Traveling craftsmen, seasonal agricultural workers, and elderly individuals without surviving relatives represented the core demographic for their expanding program. Edmund maintained detailed charts categorizing potential victims by risk level, with those scoring highest in isolation factors receiving priority consideration for experimental procedures. Geographic mobility constituted the second critical factor in victim assessment. Patients who had traveled significant distances to reach the Thornfield practice, particularly those from outside Yorkshire, offered superior security advantages. Their disappearance could be attributed to continuation of their journey, return to distant homes, or decisions to seek treatment elsewhere. Margaret developed elaborate filing systems tracking patient origins, creating detailed maps that identified optimal hunting grounds for future victim recruitment. The family's victim processing methodology evolved into a sophisticated sequence of psychological manipulation and physical preparation. Initial consultations were designed to assess not only medical conditions but also social connections, financial resources, and potential for generating investigative interest. Patients who met selection criteria were gradually isolated from outside contact through claims of contagious conditions, requirements for extended observation periods, or recommendations for specialized treatments available only at the Thornfield facility. Margaret's role expanded significantly during this operational refinement period. Her nursing background provided invaluable expertise in patient management, medication administration, and medical record manipulation. She developed standardized procedures for maintaining victims in controllable states of consciousness, ensuring they remained viable subjects for extended experimental periods while preventing escape attempts or communication with potential rescuers. Victor's contributions to the family enterprise demonstrated remarkable innovation for someone his age. His medical school training in anatomy and physiology was supplemented by practical experience in maintaining live subjects under experimental conditions. He designed improved restraint systems, developed more effective sedation protocols, and created detailed documentation procedures that would allow the family to track experimental results across multiple victims and extended time periods. Even young Catherine's participation became more direct and substantial. Her apparent innocence made her invaluable for reconnaissance activities, gathering information about potential victims through seemingly casual conversations. She would engage patients in friendly discussions about their families, travel plans, and personal circumstances, extracting intelligence that her parents used to assess targeting opportunities and security risks. The basement facility underwent extensive modifications to accommodate the family's expanding operations. Additional rooms were excavated and soundproofed, creating separate spaces for different types of experimental procedures. Edmund installed improved ventilation systems to manage odors, upgraded surgical equipment to enable more sophisticated procedures, and created storage areas for the growing collection of instruments, chemicals, and documentation associated with their research activities. Financial considerations played an increasingly important role in victim selection during this period. The family had discovered that their experimental subjects often carried significant cash resources, valuable personal possessions, or property documents that could be exploited. Edmund developed techniques for extracting financial information from victims during early stages of their captivity, allowing the family to access bank accounts, sell possessions, and claim property ownership through forged documentation. The development of their body disposal network represented perhaps the most crucial advancement in operational security. Edmund cultivated relationships with medical school procurement officers, private anatomy instructors, and research physicians who required fresh cadavers for their work. These contacts provided both financial compensation and disposal services, creating a profitable market for the byproducts of the family's experimental activities. Margaret's forged documentation became increasingly sophisticated as their operation expanded. She developed standardized templates for death certificates, patient transfer records, and correspondence that could be customized for specific victim circumstances. Her ability to replicate official medical terminology, appropriate governmental seals, and authentic appearing signatures created virtually undetectable false documentation that could withstand casual scrutiny from local authorities. The psychological dynamics within the Thornfield household during this period revealed the complete moral transformation of every family member. Dinner conversations routinely included discussions of experimental results, victim selection strategies, and operational improvements. The family had created their own internal culture where torture, murder, and body trafficking were treated as legitimate professional activities deserving the same careful planning and execution as conventional medical practice. Victor's university performance actually improved during this period, as his practical experience with human anatomy and physiology provided advantages over classmates limited to textbook learning and occasional cadaver dissection. His professors noted his exceptional surgical skills and unusual comfort with procedures that disturbed other students. Nuns suspected that his expertise derived from extensive practice on living subjects who had been tortured for experimental purposes. By autumn of 1889, the Thornfield operation had achieved a level of efficiency and security that enabled systematic expansion. They had processed 12 victims through their experimental protocols, generating both valuable research data and substantial financial profits. Their reputation within the legitimate medical community continued to grow, providing perfect cover for activities that had transformed them into the most prolific family of serial killers in British history. The peak operational period of the Thornfield killing enterprise began in earnest during the winter of 1890, when Edmund implemented what he termed the acceleration protocol. This systematic expansion increased their victim processing rate from one subject every few months to multiple simultaneous captives undergoing various experimental procedures. The basement facility was operating at maximum capacity, with up to 6 individuals being held and tortured at any given time. If the systematic nature of these crimes is sending chills down your spine, you're not alone. This story represents one of the most calculated examples of medical murder in history, and sharing these dark truths helps ensure such horrors are never repeated. Hit that like button to support our efforts in bringing these forgotten crimes to light, and don't forget to subscribe for more investigations into history's most sinister secrets. The expansion required sophisticated logistical coordination that Margaret managed with the efficiency of a military quartermaster. She developed rotating schedules for victim management, ensuring that each subject received the minimum care necessary to maintain viability for experimental purposes while maximizing the family's research productivity. Her detailed charts tracked feeding schedules, medication administration, experimental procedures, and projected elimination dates for each captive. Victor's winter break from university coincided perfectly with this operational expansion, allowing him to participate fully in the family's most intensive period of criminal activity. His medical knowledge had advanced significantly during his formal education, and he brought new techniques and theoretical frameworks to their experimental procedures. Father and son worked together, developing increasingly sophisticated protocols for studying human responses to deliberate trauma, poisoning, surgical manipulation, and psychological torture. The network expansion during this period extended far beyond the immediate Millbrook area. Edmund had established contact with similar practitioners in Leeds, Manchester, and even London, creating what amounted to an informal consortium of medical professionals engaged in illegal human experimentation. These connections provided both additional disposal outlets for bodies and sources of specialized equipment and chemical compounds not readily available through legitimate medical suppliers. Catherine's role evolved from passive observer to active participant during this crucial period. At 14, she had developed the skills necessary for initial victim assessment and preparation. Her apparent youth and femininity made potential subjects less suspicious of her presence, allowing her to gather crucial intelligence about their backgrounds, connections, and vulnerabilities. She learned to administer sedatives, assist with restraint procedures, and maintain the detailed documentation that her parents required for their research activities. The family's victim acquisition methods became increasingly aggressive and sophisticated. Rather than waiting for suitable subjects to seek treatment at their practice, they began actively recruiting targets through various deceptive schemes. Edmund would visit market towns and rural communities offering free medical screenings for common ailments, identifying promising candidates who could later be contacted with offers of specialized treatment requiring temporary relocation to the Thornfield facility. Margaret developed an elaborate correspondence network with women throughout the region, offering advice on childbirth, family health issues, and domestic medical care. These relationships provided valuable intelligence about vulnerable individuals who might be suitable for experimental purposes. Pregnant women facing difficult deliveries, elderly relatives suffering from chronic conditions, and children with developmental problems all became potential targets for the family's expanding operation. The financial profits from their criminal enterprise had grown substantial enough to fund significant facility improvements and equipment purchases. The basement complex was expanded to include a dedicated surgical theater, chemical storage areas, and specialized chambers designed for specific types of experimental procedures. Edmund invested in advanced medical instruments, imported chemicals, and even photographic equipment for documenting their research results. The psychological dynamics within the household had evolved into a completely inverted moral framework where conventional ethical standards were systematically rejected in favor of what Edmund termed scientific advancement through necessary sacrifice. Family meals featured discussions of experimental techniques, victim responses, and research methodologies with the same casual tone that normal families might use to discuss weather or local gossip. Victor's academic performance continued to excel, as his practical experience provided insights that his classmates and even some professors lacked. He wrote papers on surgical techniques and anatomical observations that were praised for their innovation and precision, never revealing that his knowledge derived from extensive practice on unwilling human subjects. His professors began recommending him for advanced research opportunities and prestigious medical positions. The victim processing rate during peak operations reached levels that required careful scheduling to prevent overwhelming their disposal network. Bodies were being shipped to medical schools and private research facilities across England on a nearly weekly basis, generating income that supplemented the family's legitimate medical practice revenues. Edmund maintained meticulous financial records tracking both experimental costs and disposal profits, treating mass murder as a business enterprise requiring sound fiscal management. The family's reputation within the legitimate medical community reached its zenith during this period. Edmund was invited to speak at medical conferences, contribute articles to professional journals, and consult on difficult cases for colleagues throughout Yorkshire. His apparent dedication to advancing medical knowledge, combined with his charitable work among the poor, made him a respected figure whose true activities remained completely hidden from public scrutiny. The security measures protecting their operation had been refined through months of practical experience and careful analysis of potential vulnerabilities. Margaret maintained multiple sets of medical records, created elaborate patient transfer documentation, and established protocols for handling unexpected visitors or official inquiries. The family had contingency plans for emergency disposal of evidence, victim elimination, and facility abandonment if their activities were discovered. By spring of 1891, the Thornfield operation had processed more than 40 victims through their experimental protocols while maintaining perfect operational security. Their success had created a dangerous overconfidence that would ultimately lead to the critical mistakes and oversights that would bring their reign of terror to its inevitable conclusion. The first serious threat to the Thornfield operation emerged in May of 1891 when Sarah Henderson, sister of victim Elizabeth Moorcock, arrived in Millbrook seeking information about her missing sibling. Elizabeth had been captured 3 months earlier during one of Margaret's recruitment visits to the market town of Harrogate, where she had been identified as an ideal subject for respiratory system experiments. The official record showed that Elizabeth had received treatment for a persistent cough and had departed for London to seek employment, but Sarah's inquiries revealed inconsistencies that threatened to expose the entire operation. Sarah Henderson possessed qualities that made her exceptionally dangerous to the family's security. She was educated, persistent, and had sufficient financial resources to conduct a thorough investigation. More critically, she had maintained regular correspondence with Elizabeth and knew that her sister had no intention of travelling to London or seeking new employment. Sarah's arrival in Millbrook marked the beginning of a campaign of inquiry that would test every aspect of the family's deception and cover-up capabilities. Edmund's initial response to Sarah's investigation demonstrated the calculated ruthlessness that had enabled the family's criminal success. Rather than attempting to deflect her inquiries through conventional means, he immediately began planning her elimination while simultaneously gathering intelligence about her background, connections, and potential for generating outside investigative interest. Sarah's determination to uncover the truth about her sister's disappearance had marked her for death from the moment she entered the Thornfield medical practice. The complexity of eliminating Sarah Henderson required careful coordination among all family members. Unlike their typical victims, she was expected by relatives in her home community and had informed multiple individuals of her travel plans and investigation objectives. Her disappearance would need to be explained through elaborate documentation showing that she had completed her inquiry, received satisfactory answers about her sister's whereabouts, and departed Millbrook for a logical destination. Margaret's role in managing the Sarah Henderson threat showcased her sophisticated understanding of deception and manipulation. She created an elaborate fictional narrative explaining Elizabeth's supposed departure from Millbrook, complete with forged letters, fabricated witness statements, and detailed documentation of medical treatment that had allegedly restored Elizabeth's health. The story was carefully constructed to address every concern that Sarah had expressed while providing plausible explanations for the apparent inconsistencies in the official records. Victor's participation in the Henderson elimination demonstrated his complete transformation from aspiring physician to accomplished killer. His medical school training provided expertise in drug administration and restraint techniques that proved invaluable in subduing and controlling Sarah during her extended captivity. He assisted with the experimental procedures that Edmund conducted on her while maintaining detailed documentation of her responses and the progression of induced symptoms. The experimental protocols applied to Sarah Henderson represented the most sophisticated and prolonged torture that the family had yet conducted. Edmund viewed her as an ideal subject for testing theories about psychological manipulation combined with physical trauma. Her education and strong personality provided opportunities to study the breakdown of intellectual resistance under conditions of systematic abuse. The procedures continued for more than 2 weeks, generating extensive documentation that Edmund would later use in preparing research papers. Catherine's involvement in the Henderson case marked her transition to full partnership in the family's criminal enterprise. At 15, she had developed the skills necessary for managing victim restraints, administering medications, and assisting with complex experimental procedures. Her participation in Sarah's torture and eventual murder represented the complete corruption of a child who had been systematically groomed for participation in mass murder from early childhood. The disposal of Sarah Henderson's body required unprecedented security measures due to the investigative interest her disappearance might generate. Edmund utilized his most trusted contacts within the medical school network, arranging for immediate shipment to a private research facility in Scotland where the remains would be completely destroyed through acid dissolution. The elaborate documentation created to explain her departure included hotel receipts, railway tickets, and correspondence that would satisfy casual investigation by local authorities. The psychological stress of managing the Henderson threat had noticeable effects on family dynamics during this period. Margaret's normally meticulous record-keeping became obsessive, as she created multiple backup documentation systems and developed increasingly elaborate contingency plans for potential security breaches. Victor began experiencing nightmares and periods of anxiety that required careful management to prevent affecting his academic performance. Even Catherine showed signs of strain, becoming more withdrawn and displaying disturbing behaviors that concerned her parents. The success in eliminating Sarah Henderson while maintaining operational security provided valuable lessons that the family applied to subsequent threat management. Edmund developed standardized protocols for identifying and neutralizing potential investigators, while Margaret created template documentation that could be quickly customized for different elimination scenarios. They established additional disposal contacts and created emergency procedures for rapid facility evacuation if their activities were discovered. The Henderson case also revealed vulnerabilities in their victim selection criteria that required immediate correction. Edmund revised his protocols to place greater emphasis on family connections and social networks, ensuring that future targets possessed even more complete isolation from potential investigators. Margaret expanded her intelligence-gathering activities to include detailed background research on victim relatives and associates who might pose future threats to operational security. The family's confidence in their ability to eliminate threats and maintain their criminal enterprise reached dangerous levels following their successful management of the Henderson investigation. They had proven capable of neutralizing even the most determined and well-prepared investigator while maintaining their reputation within the legitimate medical community. This overconfidence would lead to increasingly bold victim selection and more aggressive recruitment activities that would ultimately create the conditions for their eventual exposure and downfall. By autumn of 1891, the Thornfield operation had not only survived its first serious security challenge but had emerged stronger and more sophisticated in its methods. The lessons learned from the Henderson elimination would serve them well in managing future threats, but their growing boldness and expanding operations would soon attract the attention of investigators with resources and determination that even their refined deception capabilities could not overcome. The arrival of Dr. James Whitmore in Millbrook during the winter of 1892 represented a threat unlike any the Thornfield family had previously encountered. Whitmore was a respected physician from London who had been commissioned by the Royal College of Physicians to investigate reports of unusual medical practices in rural Yorkshire communities. His credentials were impeccable, his investigative authority was official, and his methodology was systematic enough to penetrate even the most sophisticated deception. What makes this story even more chilling is how close the Thornfield family came to escaping justice entirely. Their ability to maintain a facade of respectability while conducting systematic murder demonstrates the terrifying possibility that similar operations might have existed undetected throughout history. If you're finding these revelations as disturbing as we are, please share this video with others who seek to understand the darkest chapters of medical history. Together, we ensure that these crimes are never forgotten and these victims receive the recognition they deserve. Dr. Whitmore's investigation had been prompted by statistical anomalies identified by government clerks reviewing regional mortality reports. The unusually high number of death certificates filed from the Millbrook area, combined with the disproportionate representation of transient individuals among the deceased, had attracted official attention. Whitmore's mission was to determine whether these patterns reflected natural demographic factors or evidence of systemic irregularities requiring further investigation. Edmund's initial assessment of the Whitmore threat recognized that conventional elimination strategies would be inadequate for dealing with an official investigator whose disappearance would trigger immediate and intensive scrutiny. The family required a more sophisticated approach that would discredit Whitmore's findings while maintaining their operational security. This challenge would test every aspect of their deception capabilities and criminal ingenuity. The strategy developed for managing Dr. Whitmore involved a complex combination of misdirection, fabricated evidence, and strategic cooperation designed to demonstrate the family's legitimate medical credentials while concealing all evidence of their criminal activities. Margaret worked frantically to create additional layers of false documentation that would support their cover story, while Edmund prepared to submit to official scrutiny of his medical practices and patient records. Victor's role in the Whitmore deception required him to temporarily suspend his participation in the family's experimental activities and assume the appearance of a conventional medical student assisting his father's legitimate practice. His university training provided perfect cover for his presence in the facility, while his knowledge of proper medical procedures enabled him to assist in creating a convincing facade of normal healthcare operations. Catherine's participation proved crucial in gathering intelligence about Whitmore's investigation methods and objectives. Her apparent innocence allowed her to engage the visiting physician in casual conversations that revealed valuable information about his suspicions, his planned activities, and his timeline for completing the investigation. This intelligence enabled the family to stay ahead of his inquiries and prepare appropriate responses to his questions. The temporary suspension of their experimental activities required elaborate procedures for concealing evidence and managing existing victims. The basement facility was thoroughly cleaned and reconfigured to appear as a legitimate medical treatment area, while any subjects currently undergoing experimental procedures were either immediately eliminated or transferred to secure locations outside Millbrook. The family's disposal network was activated to remove all traces of their criminal activities from the immediate area. Dr. Whitmore's investigation methodology proved more thorough and sophisticated than the family had anticipated. He conducted detailed interviews with community members, reviewed medical records dating back several years, and performed statistical analyses of mortality patterns that revealed subtle inconsistencies in the official documentation. His medical expertise enabled him to identify discrepancies in treatment records and death certificates that less qualified investigators might have overlooked. The psychological pressure of maintaining their deception under official scrutiny created severe stress within the Thornfield household. Margaret's normally precise record-keeping became erratic as she struggled to maintain consistency across multiple layers of false documentation. Victor's academic performance suffered as he divided his attention between university studies and the demanding requirements of the family's cover-up activities. Even Catherine showed signs of strain, becoming increasingly withdrawn and displaying nervous behaviors that threatened to attract unwanted attention. Edmund's strategy for discrediting Whitmore's investigation involved subtle suggestions that the visiting physician's concerns reflected urban prejudices against rural medical practices rather than legitimate professional issues. He organized testimonials from grateful patients, arranged for community leaders to vouch for his charitable work, and presented evidence of his medical credentials and professional achievements. This campaign was designed to position any criticism of his practices as attacks on rural medicine rather than justified concerns about criminal activity. The investigation reached its most dangerous phase when Whitmore began requesting access to specific patient records and demanding detailed explanations for mortality patterns that deviated from regional norms. Edmund was forced to provide increasingly elaborate justifications for statistical anomalies while maintaining the appearance of cooperative transparency. The strain of this deception required careful coordination among all family members to ensure consistency in their responses to official inquiries. Margaret's role in managing the documentary evidence became crucial as Whitmore's investigation intensified. She was required to produce detailed patient files, correspondence records, and financial documentation that would support the family's claims of legitimate medical practice. Her ability to create convincing false documentation under extreme time pressure demonstrated the sophisticated skills she had developed through years of criminal activity. The family's network of corrupt contacts proved invaluable during this crisis period. Local officials provided advance warning of Whitmore's planned activities, while disposal contacts assisted in removing evidence and relocating any materials that might compromise the investigation's outcome. These relationships, cultivated through years of careful bribery and mutual benefit arrangements, provided crucial support during the family's most vulnerable period. The resolution of the Whitmore investigation represented both a triumph of criminal deception and a warning of future vulnerabilities. Edmund's success in satisfying the official inquiry while concealing the true nature of his activities demonstrated the sophisticated capabilities the family had developed. However, the experience also revealed how close they had come to exposure and the growing risks associated with their continued operations in an increasingly scrutinized environment. The emergence of Father Michael Brennan as an unwitting investigator into the Thornfield crimes began innocuously in the spring of 1893, when the parish priest noticed discrepancies in burial records that had accumulated over several years of the family's operations. Father Brennan possessed a meticulous nature and deep concern for his parishioners that made him particularly sensitive to irregularities in death documentation. His growing suspicions would prove far more dangerous to the family than any official investigation. Father Brennan's concerns initially focused on the unusual number of transient individuals who had allegedly died of natural causes while receiving treatment at the Thornfield practice. The priest's careful review of parish records revealed that these deaths occurred at rates significantly higher than statistical norms would suggest, and that many of the deceased had supposedly been buried in distant locations with no local funeral services or family notification procedures. The priest's investigation methodology differed fundamentally from Dr. Whitmore's official inquiry. Rather than relying on medical expertise and governmental authority, Father Brennan utilized his extensive network of community relationships and his intimate knowledge of local social dynamics. His conversations with parishioners gradually revealed a pattern of missing persons, unexplained departures, and family concerns that had never been officially reported or investigated. Edmund's assessment of the Father Brennan threat recognized that the priest's moral authority and community connections made him exceptionally dangerous despite his lack of official investigative powers. Religious leaders possessed influence that could not be easily discredited or eliminated, and their concerns carried weight with both local authorities and the broader community. The family would need to develop entirely new strategies for managing this unprecedented challenge. Margaret's role in monitoring Father Brennan's activities required her to infiltrate Catholic social circles and religious organizations where she had never previously maintained a presence. Her Protestant background made this infiltration particularly challenging, but her nursing experience and charitable work provided credible reasons for interaction with church-sponsored community activities. Through these connections, she gathered intelligence about the priest's suspicions and planned activities. The priest's investigation gained momentum when he began systematically interviewing families who had reported missing relatives to church authorities rather than civil officials. Many poor and immigrant families distrusted government institutions but maintained strong relationships with religious leaders, making Father Brennan privy to information that had never reached official investigators. His discovery of multiple unreported disappearances created a comprehensive picture of the Thornfield operation's true scope. Victor's participation in managing the Father Brennan threat required him to assume a more prominent role in community religious activities than had ever been necessary for maintaining the family's cover. His apparent devotion to charitable work and medical mission activities helped counter growing suspicions about the family's true nature. However, his lack of genuine religious conviction created stress and inconsistencies that threatened to expose his deceptive participation. The development of Father Brennan's evidence collection presented unique challenges for the family's security protocols. Unlike official investigators who relied on documentation and statistical analysis, the priest was gathering testimony from individuals who had been ignored by conventional authorities. His ability to inspire trust and encourage disclosure meant that information previously considered secure was becoming accessible to someone with both the moral authority and community connections to act on his discoveries. Catherine's involvement in monitoring Father Brennan's activities exploited her position as a young woman whose apparent innocence provided access to church activities and religious social gatherings. Her participation in confession, charity work, and religious education allowed her to gather intelligence about the priest's investigation while maintaining the family's reputation for moral respectability. However, her growing role as a spy within religious institutions created psychological conflicts that manifested in increasingly disturbing behavior patterns. The family's response to Father Brennan's investigation required careful calibration to avoid actions that might confirm his suspicions while preventing him from gathering additional evidence. Edmund began attending church services regularly, made substantial donations to religious charities, and volunteered his medical services for church-sponsored community health programs. These activities were designed to demonstrate the family's moral character while providing opportunities to monitor the priest's activities. Margaret's documentation management became increasingly complex as Father Brennan's investigation expanded to include families and individuals who had never been part of the official record-keeping systems. She was required to create retrospective evidence explaining disappearances that had occurred years earlier, while ensuring consistency with information that might be provided by community members during religious counseling sessions or informal conversations with church authorities. The psychological pressure created by Father Brennan's investigation proved more intense than the family had experienced during previous security challenges. Religious moral authority represented a form of scrutiny that could not be easily deflected through corruption, intimidation, or bureaucratic manipulation. The priest's investigation was motivated by genuine concern for missing parishioners rather than professional obligations or career advancement, making him resistant to conventional neutralization strategies. The turning point in Father Brennan's investigation came when he discovered Mary Whitmore's forged departure letter in the personal effects of her former landlord. The priest's familiarity with Mary's handwriting, acquired through years of correspondence about church matters, immediately revealed that the letter was fraudulent. This discovery provided concrete evidence of deception that could not be explained through innocent miscommunication or administrative error. Armed with proof of deliberate fraud in at least one disappearance case, Father Brennan began preparing a comprehensive report documenting his findings for submission to both church authorities and civil officials. His investigation had uncovered evidence linking the Thornfield family to multiple unexplained disappearances, fraudulent documentation, and systematic deception extending over several years. The priest's moral obligation to seek justice for missing parishioners had created an existential threat to the family's continued operations. The family's recognition that Father Brennan's investigation could not be neutralized through conventional means marked the beginning of their most desperate and dangerous period. Edmund began developing contingency plans for eliminating the priest while creating plausible explanations for his death that would not trigger intensive investigation. However, the moral and practical complexities of murdering a respected religious leader presented challenges that would test every aspect of their criminal capabilities and ultimately contribute to their downfall. The confrontation between Father Brennan and Edmund Thornfield erupted on a fog-shrouded October evening in 1893, when the priest arrived at the medical practice demanding answers about the fraudulent letter he had discovered among Mary Whitmore's possessions. Armed with concrete evidence of deception and driven by moral outrage over the fate of his missing parishioners, Father Brennan represented the most immediate existential threat the family had ever faced. His determination to expose their crimes had reached a point where elimination appeared to be their only viable option for survival. Edmund's initial response to the priest's accusations demonstrated the calculated charm and professional authority that had enabled years of successful deception. He expressed shock and concern about the forged letter, suggested that someone had obviously victimized poor Mary after her departure from Millbrook, and offered to assist the church in investigating this apparent fraud perpetrated by unknown criminals. His performance was masterful, combining indignation, sympathy, and professional expertise in a way designed to deflect suspicion while appearing fully cooperative. Father Brennan's persistence in pursuing his accusations revealed both his moral courage and his naive understanding of the true danger he faced. The priest had documented numerous disappearances, identified patterns of fraudulent documentation, and gathered testimony from families whose loved ones had vanished after seeking treatment at the Thornfield practice. His evidence was comprehensive enough to trigger official investigation and detailed enough to expose the family's systematic criminal enterprise. The family's emergency response to Father Brennan's confrontation required immediate activation of their most extreme security protocols. Margaret began destroying sensitive documentation while preparing false evidence that might support alternative explanations for the priest's discoveries. Victor was summoned from university to assist with what Edmund euphemistically termed crisis management, but which actually involved planning the murder of a respected religious leader whose disappearance would inevitably trigger intensive investigation. Catherine's role during this crisis period demonstrated her complete transformation into a willing participant in the family's criminal activities. At 16, she possessed the skills and emotional detachment necessary for assisting with victim restraint, evidence destruction, and witness elimination. Her participation in planning Father Brennan's murder represented the final corruption of a child who had been systematically groomed for participation in mass killing from early childhood. The attempted cover-up that followed Father Brennan's initial confrontation involved elaborate efforts to discredit his accusations while creating plausible alternative explanations for the evidence he had gathered. Edmund began circulating suggestions that the priest's concerns reflected mental instability brought on by excessive religious devotion and the stress of ministering to an impoverished rural community. This character assassination campaign was designed to undermine the credibility of any accusations Father Brennan might make to official authorities. Margaret's documentation efforts during this period focused on creating false evidence that would support the family's claims of innocence while explaining away the irregularities that Father Brennan had identified. She prepared elaborate patient files showing successful treatments and voluntary departures, forged correspondence from supposedly living former patients, and created financial records demonstrating the legitimate nature of the family's medical practice. The psychological pressure created by Father Brennan's investigation had begun affecting all family members in ways that threatened their operational security. Edmund's normally controlled demeanor showed signs of strain that were noticed by observant community members. Margaret's meticulous attention to detail became obsessive and erratic, leading to mistakes in her record-keeping that created new vulnerabilities. Victor's academic performance declined noticeably as he struggled to balance university obligations with the demanding requirements of the family crisis. The turning point came when Father Brennan announced his intention to travel to York to present his findings to both church authorities and government officials who possessed the resources necessary for conducting a thorough investigation. This announcement forced the family to recognize that conventional deception and misdirection would be inadequate for managing the threat. Edmund made the decision that the priest would have to be eliminated before he could communicate his discoveries to outside authorities. The planning for Father Brennan's murder represented the most complex and dangerous operation the family had ever attempted. Unlike their typical victims, the priest was expected by his congregation, maintained regular correspondence with church superiors, and followed predictable schedules that made his disappearance immediately noticeable. The family would need to create an explanation for his death that appeared natural while ensuring that his evidence was destroyed before it could be discovered by investigators. Edmund's strategy involved poisoning Father Brennan during what would appear to be a routine pastoral visit to treat a fabricated medical emergency. The priest's known commitment to ministering to the sick would ensure his response to an urgent summons, while his death could be attributed to heart failure brought on by the stress of his pastoral duties. Margaret prepared appropriate documentation showing that the priest had suffered from previously undiagnosed cardiac problems that made sudden death plausible. The execution of their plan began when Catherine delivered an urgent message to Father Brennan claiming that a dying parishioner required immediate last rites. The priest's predictable response to this summons led him directly into the trap that the family had prepared. However, Father Brennan's arrival at the Thornfield practice coincided with unexpected visits from community members who had come seeking medical treatment, creating complications that would prove fatal to the family's operational security. The presence of witnesses during Father Brennan's murder attempt forced the family to improvise solutions that created new evidence and additional complications. Edmund was required to actually treat the legitimate patients while simultaneously managing the priest's elimination, leading to mistakes and inconsistencies that would later provide crucial evidence for investigators. Margaret's efforts to maintain normal operations while concealing criminal activity resulted in documentation errors that created permanent records of the family's desperate improvisation. The aftermath of Father Brennan's murder marked the beginning of the end for the Thornfield criminal enterprise. The priest's death attracted immediate attention from church authorities who were already aware of his investigation into missing parishioners. His evidence, carefully preserved and documented according to religious procedures, survived his death and provided investigators with a comprehensive roadmap for exposing the family's crimes. The systematic elimination campaign that had protected the family for years had finally encountered a victim whose moral authority and institutional connections made his silencing impossible to achieve without triggering the very investigation they had sought to prevent.